Classic horror films like the mother-loving Norman Bates and Psycho, 1960, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, and The Silence of the Lambs, 1991, were all based on one real-life killer, Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. There were others that were also based on Ed Gein's and his tastes. I do recommend that you look them up. 3 on a Meat Hook, 1972. Deranged Confessions of a Necrophile, 1974. Maniac, 1980. Ed and His Mother with Steve Buscemi in 1993. In the Light of the Moon, 2000. Ed Gein, The Butcher of Plainfield, 2007. Ed Gein, The Musical, 2010. And Child of God, 2014. Plainfield, Wisconsin is a sleepy little town located just about smack in the middle of Wisconsin. It's east of the intersection of State Highway 73 and Highway 39. In 1957, it was even smaller and more quaint. A little farming town. No one thought such evil and depravity could exist here. In November of 1957, following the disappearance of a local shop owner, police set out to question the shop owner's last customer, a one Ed Gein. Ed Gein was found eating dinner in plain checkers at the West Plainfield grocery store. When police entered Ed's home, they walked straight into the house of horrors. Not only did they find the woman that they were looking for, Denise Warden, dead, decapitated, and hung from her ankles by the rafters. But they also found objects that Ed had crafted using human body parts that he had dug up from 3 local graveyards. Police found skulls used as bowls, human organs, and gruesome pieces that he had made into furniture, lampshades made of human faces, and the skin and chairs that he had upholstered with human skin. He later explained to police that he had intended to create a skin suit to quasi-resurrect his dead mother, with whom he'd been obsessed with for years. Born Edward Theodore Gein on 27 August 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin, Ed was raised by his domineering mother, Augusta. Ed and his brother Henry were raised to believe that the world was full of evil. Women were vessels of sin, and that drinking was an instrument of the devil. Ed's parents, George and Augusta, spent their early life running a general store in La Crosse. Augusta insisted that the family needed to move from La Crosse, a quote sinkhole of filth, as she called it, to Plainfield. Even though the family settled well outside of town, she believed that living in any town would corrupt her 2 young sons. Ed and Henry left the family's isolated farmhouse to only go to school. Because of the distance from their home to town, Ed and Henry failed to establish any meaningful connections with classmates. Most remembered Ed as, socially awkward and prone to wild and unexplained outbursts of laughter. Ed's lazy eye and speech impediments also made him an easy victim of bullies. Ed Gein was a quiet, eccentric man who was considered odd, but friendly and harmless by most of Plainfield's residents. Ed preferred life on the farm and adored his mother. George Gein, Ed's father, was a feckless, unreliable individual and a horrible alcoholic. George Gein, his life began in tragedy, and at a very young age, while coming to Wisconsin, his entire family drowned in a river. This may have slightly affected his outlook on life. George was then raised by another family that really didn't want him, but felt like they should raise him, and they did their best. As an adult, George became a violent drunk. Augusta's religious fanaticism shaped much of what Ed was to become. So did the abuse from his father that helped cement Ed's bond with his mother. George Gein died in 1940. Ed and his brother Henry had to absorb all of life's lessons about the world from their mother. The brothers seemed to embrace her worldview, though. Though Henry sometimes stood up to Augusta, Ed never did. So it's no surprise that Ed Gein's first victim was more than likely his older brother Henry. In 1944, Ed and Henry went out to clear some vegetation in the fields near their home by burning it all away. It's a common process. Only one of the brothers would live through that night, though. As they worked, their fire suddenly went out of control. When firefighters arrived to put out the blaze, Ed said that Henry had vanished. There was a lantern and flashlight-lit search of the property for Henry. Henry's body was found several hours later after the search had begun. He was face down in the marsh, dead from what looked like an apparent heart attack. When Henry was found, he seemed to have been dead for some time, though. And there weren't any burns on his body. Henry was dead at 42 years old. At the time, it seemed like a tragic accident. But accident or not, Henry's death meant that Ed Gein and Augusta had the farmhouse all to themselves. They lived there together in isolation for about a year until Augusta's death in 1945. She had suffered a stroke, was wheelchair bound, and Ed was her sole caretaker. After his mother's death, Ed began his decade-long descent into madness and depravity. Ed had transformed the house into something a bit like a shrine to his mother's memory. He sealed up rooms that his mother had used, keeping them in pristine condition, just as she had left them. He moved everything into a small bedroom just off the kitchen. That's where he lived. Most of the house looked like something out of a hoarder's TV show, except for the few shrine rooms. Living alone, far from town, he began to sink into his obsessions and deeper into madness. Ed filled his days by reading about Nazi medical experiments, studying human anatomy, consuming porn. He never attempted to date any real-life women, and reading horror novels, that's what he filled his time with. He began to indulge in his sick fantasies, but it took a long time for anyone to realize it. Ed was a trusted person. He seemed meek and mild-mannered. Ed worked as a handyman in town. He helped neighbors with things in their homes or at their farms, and even babysitting their children at times. For a full decade, no one thought much of Ed Gein or his farm. Down some little quiet dirt road, well out of town. Everything changed in November 1957 when a local hardware store owner named Bernice Warden vanished, leaving nothing behind but bloodstains in her Plainfield hardware store. Warden was a 58-year-old widow. She had last been seen working in her store. Her last customer, Ed Gein. Ed had gone into her store to buy a gallon of antifreeze. Bernice's son, a deputy sheriff, Sheriff Frank Warden, entered the store at approximately 5 p.m. and found the crime scene. The deputy knew that Ed Gein had been in the store that day, and he had also been in the day prior. He had said that he would return today to get the antifreeze that he needed. Police searched for the last customer and any kind of receipts. Ed Gein, they wanted to question him. They wanted to question this man. They found him eating at the West Plainfield grocery store. The county sheriff department entered Ed's farmhouse in order to investigate the missing person. When they did, they found themselves in the middle of a waking, unbelievable nightmare. As soon as investigators stepped into the house, they found Bernice Warden, or what was left of her, in the kitchen. She was obviously dead, decapitated. Ed was in the middle of butchering her like a deer. There she was, hanging by her ankles, like an animal from the rafters. The torso was, quote, dressed out like a deer. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, and the mutilations were made after her death. Searching the house, authorities found whole human bones and fragments, a wastebasket made of human skin covering several chairs, skulls on his bedpost, female skulls, some with the top sewn off so that they were bowls, and other bowls from the skull caps. A corset made from a female torso, skinned from shoulder to waist. Leggings made from human leg skin. Masks made from the skin of female heads. Mary Hogan's face mask in a paper bag. Mary Hogan's skull in a box. Bernice Warden's entire head in a burlap sack. Bernice Warden's heart in a plastic bag in front of Ed Gein's potbelly stove. 9 female sexual organs, in a shoebox. A young girl's dress, and the female sexual organs of 2 females judged to have been about 15 years old. A belt made from female human nipples. 4 noses clipped from the skulls and faces of the bodies that he dug up. A pair of lips on a window shade drawstring. A lampshade made from the skin of human faces. Fingernails from female fingers. There were also countless bones, whole and in fragments, skulls impaled on bedposts, bowls and kitchen utensils made from skulls and body parts. Authorities found chairs upholstered with human skin, a wastebasket made of skin. Police also found various dismembered body parts, including fingernails. They also found the remains of Mary Hogan, a tavern keeper, who also had gone missing in 1954. These artifacts were photographed at the State Crime Laboratory in Wisconsin, and then decently disposed of. When questioned, Ed Gein had told investigators that between 1947 and 1952, he had made as many as 40 nighttime visits to the 3 local graveyards to exhume recently buried bodies. he was in a, quote, dazed-like state. On about 30 of those visits, he said that he came out of the daze while in the cemetery, left the grave in good order, and returned home empty-handed. Ed said at times he would drive his car, or he would walk the 5 or so miles to the Plainfield cemetery, and sometimes wake up next to the grave of his mother, not knowing how he had gotten there. On other occasions, he dug up the graves of recently buried middle-aged women he thought resembled his mother and took their bodies home, where he tanned their skins to make his sick paraphernalia. He told authorities that he wanted to create a human woman suit so he could become his mother and crawl into her skin. Gein admitted to stealing from 9 graves and led investigators to their exact locations. Alan Volmovsky of the State Crime Laboratory participated in opening 3 test graves that were specifically identified by Ed Gein. Gein had robbed the graves soon after the funerals while the graves were not quite completed. The test graves were exhumed because authorities were uncertain as to whether the slight Ed Gein was capable of single-handedly digging up graves during a single evening. But they did find the caskets as Ed Gein described them. One casket was empty. Another casket contained only Gein's crowbar, and the final casket saw most of the body missing. Yet Gein had returned rings and some other body parts to the caskets. Thus, Ed Gein's confessions were largely corroborated. Ed readily admitted that he had collected most of the remains, dug up from 3 local graveyards, which he had started to visit 2 years after his mother, Augusta's death. Ed used his maroon 1949 Ford sedan to transport the bodies of the 2 women he murdered, as well as those he exhumed from fresh graves in nearby cemeteries. Following the police interview, the butcher of Plainfield was arrested and transferred to the county jail. The jail is located at 221 South St. Maurice Street and now houses a county historical museum, including items of Ed's and the cell that he was held in. Some paranormal investigators who have visited in recent years believe Ed, that he still lingers there. On 21 November 1957, Ed Gein was arraigned on only 1 count of first-degree murder. He pled not guilty for reasons of insanity. Ed was found not guilty for reasons of insanity in 1957 and sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, now known as Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, where Ed was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Ed's farmhouse, lands, and property were to be auctioned off. Rumors abounded about the property. The townsfolk feared that the property would become a macabre tourist attraction, kind of like what it is today. That it would turn into some kind of House of Horrors attraction. In March of 1958, Ed's farmhouse mysteriously burned to the ground. Arson, of course, was suspected, but the cause of the fire and the perpetrator was never officially determined or identified. It was possibly that the fire was not considered major urgency by the fire chief, Frank Warden, another son of Gein's victim, Bernice Warden. When Gein learned of the incident while in detention, he shrugged and said, just as well. The land, outbuildings, and everything that Ed Gein's family had owned was still up for grabs. and the auction went on while the charred and smoking ruins of the house still smoldered and smoked. Even after all this time, it still attracts visitors daily. Many disregard the cattle fence, the no trespassing signage, and bravely wander the property, risking the wrath of Ed, his mother, or one of the many additional specters that may reside on the property. The property is heavily wooded now, and has no visible signs of a house or any other structure had ever been there on the property.